on Thursday, the 21st. And that was the quickest turnaround of a major address we ever had. That was a draft of a speech to Congress, which would be given to the largest audience in human history, and they wanted that draft in one day. And we did it. We didn't have a conclusion, but we drafted the speech. But the president called us in and gave us basically the organization of the speech by saying, Americans have questions. Who attacked our country? Why do they hate us? How do we fight and win the war? And et cetera. And that was pretty much the organizing principle of the speech, the questions that Americans had.
In general, how did the president prepare for his speeches?
President Bush, he really prepared. He would read things through. He would make his edits, and sometimes he would call the writer, or he would give the edits to the staff secretary, and the staff secretary would pass them along, or sometimes he would call Mike Gerson, and Mike would bring them into the team. But then when he had the final draft, if it was a major event like the State of the Union, which is the speech that the speechwriters hate most because it's so huge and so unwieldy, and it has so much. It has to cover so many bases that you write 25 transitions in one speech. You usually have three or four transitions. But a speech like that, you have to cover so many different topics. And so that's a tough one. And also, the delivered draft of the State of the Union is draft 30. And so it's an endless process. And it is also one of about 20 speeches the president gives in January. So it's not like you have a reprieve from everything else. To answer the question, when the president would have a State of the Union, we would do a heavy outline for him around Christmas time, and then he would react to it. And the outline would be based on the policy input that had been generated over the preceding few months. Okay, what's he going to talk about in the State of the Union? What's going to be the program for the year just begun? And then we would sit down and do the first draft. And then that would go through a very small, a fraction of the ordinary staffing process, just a few of the very top people, the vice president, a few others. And then you would go for the second draft, and then it would be a slightly broader staffing. And then you'd get it to the president, and then the president, I remember that's when we would go and sit in the Oval Office, and he would sit back in his chair and read that speech aloud. Throughout the State of the Union process, that's when I would see the president the most, more than any other speech. In general, that's true, because he would practice it. There would be there's a movie theater in the White House about a third of the width of this room, about as deep, with curtains and a movie screen and movie theater seating, and that's where he would practice these big speeches. And if you were involved in the speech, you were expected to be there during the practice. And so they'd set up the lectern and the teleprompter, and he would read things through and edit there. So that was a very elaborate, involved process. He did the same thing with the address to Congress after 9/11. It just was very telescoped, right? It all happened within a space of 2-3 days. And then for the typical speech, he didn't use a teleprompter probably more than 10 times a year. President Obama used it, 10 times a week. And Reagan used it a lot more than George W. Bush did. But if it was a non-teleprompter event, which is the typical case, he would read it aloud. He would underline things. He would practice it. He would edit up until the very end. Not edit in the sense that he would call the speechwriter if he wanted one word changed on page 4. Sometimes he would just scribble that in, or make a couple notes to himself at the top. But I have told people I have worked for who do public speaking in the private sector now, in some cases don't think they're very good at it. And I often remind them that not everybody's good at it, but you can be if